I'm really excited to be able to share some results from our third year now from our Black Swift movement ecology. I'm Rob Sparks, and I work for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And that's me in the picture extracting a black swift from a mist net. So I hope everybody could hear me okay. So I just want to give a brief introduction on the organization I work for, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. Our mission is to conserve birds and their habitats through an integrated approach with 3 teams: science, stewardship, and education. So these are represented in the pictures on the right of the slide. So with science, we're able to monitor bird populations and test hypotheses. With stewardship, we collaborate with private landowners and stakeholders. And with education, we teach and inspire the next generation. And our work radiates across the Rockies and the Great Plains. So please, if you haven't heard of us, look us up. We have also a lot of virtual events occurring in the next few weeks. So this is definitely not an individual effort. Here's the current Black Swift team. And this picture, you could see Colin Woolley in the upper left. He's our master bander at Bird Conservancy. And Greg Lewandowski's in the middle. He's an independent researcher. And myself on the bottom right, we're banding swifts at Fulton Resurgence Cave in this picture. So the outline of my talk tonight, I'll review our timeline, when we deploy GPS units and wing activity devices, and the number of devices we recaptured. And then I'll be presenting on the breeding space use results from our GPS units we recovered, and briefly touch on some really interesting winter space use from the wing activity devices. This map shows the black swift's full annual movement cycle from breeding, migration to wintering for a population in Colorado. And they breed in the months of June to August and migrate in the fall and September, and overwinter from November to April, followed by a spring migration. The black dots on this map are the GPS data set we recovered from Box Canyon. And the yellow line is from our geolocator data set that we published in 2012. And the wintering ground distribution is also from our geolocator data set. This puts their annual movement patterns into context. So the movement ecology timeline starts in 2017, and we set out to discover the black swift's foraging patterns, which were unknown, as well as obtain more precise migration route locations and better understand their flight patterns during the wintering period. So we deployed 5 GPS units in 2017, and you could see a picture of a GPS unit in the bottom left. In 2018, we recaptured 2 of the 5 GPS units, with one of them having a great data set and the other one really didn't capture many data points. We think this was due to the nape feathers covering their solar panels on the GPS unit that allow for a longer battery life. In 2018, we also deployed 7 wing activity devices, and this was in collaboration with Anders Hendenstrom. He's a researcher at the University of Lund, and he discovered the common swift's aerial roost during the wintering period. So he sent us 6 wing activity devices that we deployed. And in 2019, we recaptured 6 of the 7 wing activity devices. So that was really exciting to be able to recover some of those, a big number of those wing activity devices. And we also deployed additional GPS tags that were donated by the Canadian Wildlife Service. And they have a really big interest in understanding black swift movement ecology because in Canada, they're listed as endangered now. And the picture below and the picture in the bottom right shows the wing activity devices. They're really similar to geolocators and are similar in dimensions to the GPS units. And in 2020, this year, we hope to recapture some of the more GPS units. And yeah, we'll see what happens this field season. So the black swift movement occurs on a wide spectrum of spatial temporal scales, from breeding to migration and wintering periods. And it's important to understand that piece to get a better hold of their population dynamics and how they're using the landscape. So understanding movement patterns is paramount for species conservation, especially for species in decline. As I mentioned, they're listed as endangered in Canada, and they seem to be having a steep population trend, a decline in population trends, according to the Breeding Bird Survey. So we're interested in identifying home range size and resource use, which will inform wildlife management. However, this information is lacking for many species due to their low density or cryptic nature. So this is our study area, so the state of Colorado. And the results I'll be presenting are from Box Canyon. It's one of the largest black swift colonies in Colorado, and it's represented in the as a black triangle, and it's just east of Telluride. If you've never been there, I recommend visiting that site. It's a state park, and it has a walkway where you could go into the canyon and actually see black swift, the black swift colony. The field methods I use, we use mist nets and handheld nets as well. And we use a backpack harness method to attach the GPS unit. I didn't anticipate that the volume would be that loud during my presentation, so I stopped it. But we use a backpack harness method, and we've been successful. We use trameline to attach it to the bird. And from the GPS tags and wing activity devices we've recaptured, we were very happy to see that they're healthy and they don't show any signs of abrasion on their bodies, which is a very good sign. So I'm just going to fast forward this video so you can kind of see the GPS unit there on the back as we process the bird. You can see it right here, and we have a spacer so it's not too snug on the bird. And you can kind of make out the solar panels as well on there. And so now focusing on the breeding season space use, their aerial black swifts are aerial insectivores. They forage on aerial plankton, so insects that are in the air column while in flight. So it's thought that they forage long distances from the nest, but foraging from patterns were unknown until now. So movement patterns are linked to the amount of available resources and their distribution in space and time. And specifically, resources influence foraging activity and distances traveled across the landscape. So here I have an animation of the GPS data set that we recovered. And we programmed the GPS unit to capture locations every 15 minutes. So we want to understand how swifts are using the landscape, and to do this, we used location-based drivers that defines preferential use of the resources, and that provides information about how swifts are using the available habitat. And I'll get into the methods here in a little bit. There's also location-based drivers. So these are covariates we could put on the movement or the path and examine differences in the movement rates that could be explained by the environment. And we also very interested in developing a home range, and we use the utilization distribution for that. So the method we use is it kind of discretizes time. So this was developed, this continuous time Markov chain model we used was developed by Hanks, Hooton, and Aldridge, and it's a paper called Continuous Time Discrete Space Models. So basically, it's a stochastic process that looks at animal transition rates in continuous time between a set of grids that you could see here over our study area. So it's similar to resource selection analysis with available resources defined as the neighboring grid cells. The transition rate to each neighboring cell contains information that defines preferential use of the resources in each cell. So the estimates from the model provide information then about how animals are using the available habitat. So the takeaway is that we're estimating the rate and direction at which it travels through space. So the covariates we used rasters, a scale of 500-meter grids. And as I mentioned, we have two classes of covariates. There's a location-based drivers, which are dependent on the landscape in the cell and the 500-meter grid. And then we have directional covariates as well, which capture directional bias in movement, so along the covariate gradients. And so the location-based covariates, kind of the effects of the landscape, control the desire of the swift to stay in a cell due to the current habitat, while directional drivers control attraction or repulsion to the neighboring cells due to the improvement in the neighboring habitat relative to the current habitat. So the map I'm showing here is just an example of how we gridded out our study area, and we estimated river length within each cell, elevation, and then the TWI is the topographic wetness index. So it just kind of looks at soil moisture. So those were the landscape-based covariates, and the directional bias and movement covariates were distance from nest to see if there's an attraction towards the nest, and as well as elevation. And the CRW covariate is just to look at directional persistence. It's a correlated random walk covariate. So here are some results. So these estimates I have boxes around that do two different kinds of covariates. And so these estimates explain the directional bias in the movement patterns and how absolute animal movement rates are related to the environment. So the negative values for the location-based drivers just depict slower movement in grid cells with higher covariate values. So they're moving slower in areas where there's a lot of river length, and slower at higher elevations. And then for the directional bias and movement in the top box, and I should mention that the bolded values showed strong effects. So the directional bias and movement, there was a strong effect for distance to nest. So it seems like they are returning back to the nest, which makes sense at the end of the day. And then the CRW covariate is just it's maintaining its direction of movement over time. And so what does all this mean? So we were successful in analyzing this GPS data set using a continuous time discrete space model. And it reveals how environmental covariates influence black swift foraging behavior. And we're also able to develop core use areas during the breeding season. So foraging duration increased with elevation in areas with rivers or close to rivers. And that's probably likely related to higher insect abundance occurring near water and insect hatch date. Subalpine insect phenology during the month of August. So keep in mind that the status sets for the month of August corresponds with snowmelt, which may explain the foraging at higher elevations. And the distances forage were pretty far, on average 160 kilometers daily. So we think that insect availability is localized across the landscape and may be related to shorter insect flight durations during the late summer. So we're finally kind of piecing the foraging ecology together. It's and here's the utilization distribution that's derived from this continuous time Markov chain model. So the coefficient estimates, so we have transition rates throughout our study area. And from that, we use those transition rates to develop the utilization distribution. So kind of like a home range use. And so the transition rates to each neighboring cell contains information that defines preferential use of the resources in each cell, and therefore provides information about how animals are using the available habitat. So this utilization distribution is similar to resource selection or a mechanistic home range modeling, where it's we're able to use covariates instead of kind of a kernel density estimation. So this map is showing, you can see the black triangle is the nest site, and then the white dots are all the GPS locations. And then the gradient of colors from light to dark are the density in use. And then the red grids are a hotspot analysis that I did. So that there are a hotspot close to the nest, just northwest of the nest. And during the morning, I think that's a temporal effect where they're doing some foraging closer to the nest and then kind of expanding out as the day progresses. So some management recommendations we could develop from this is to protect the colony site. Our nest site protection will be critical because they're most vulnerable at the nest. They also have low fecundity, so they only lay one egg during the season. So if we lose a nest site, it could have serious implications for population growth. And then we could also develop core areas based on the utilization distribution I just showed, and around the hotspot analysis that we showed as well. So you could have different core use areas, and also the manager should keep in mind the temporal implications. We should also identify the rivers within the study area so we could protect them, and our areas near rivers. And then we should consider the time when management occurs. So there's large swaths of beetle kill areas in Colorado, and we should avoid treating beetle kill in the month of August and high elevations when they're there. Now to briefly get into the wintering space use, this is from the 6 wing activity devices that we recaptured. And this is within their wintering area. So they winter in the Amazon, mostly in Brazil. And here, this map is depicting that. And so we were most interested in looking at the aerial roosting behavior, whether they were aerial roosting, and their flight patterns during the wintering period. So these wing activity devices measure the wing beats on 3 axes, a Z, an X, and a Y. They also are able to measure pressure. So this graph is showing the wing activity. So just focus on the top panel. We have hours on the Y-axis, so time of day, And on the y-axis, it's about a 48-hour period. And on the x-axis, we have months. So from September to August. And the top panel, the white color shows maximum wing activity. So they're flapping their wings at a higher rate. Then at the darker colors show a decrease in wing activity. So these boxes are highlighting nighttime periods, and during the nighttime, they're beating their wings. So we're able to confirm that in fact black swifts are aerial roosting. This is super exciting. They've found that other swift species do this. The common swift of Europe, the pallid swift and alpine swift also aerial roost. And so this is really some really exciting results here. And then so I also want to point out, as you go down the x-axis to June, you see it's dark. So that's during their breeding season. So they're not flying at night during the breeding season. They're roosting at their nest site. I'm not going to get into the other panels, but these geolocators were also able to look at altitude and temperature. Just one other interesting finding that we're seeing with these wing activity devices during the wintering period is that they're ascending at higher elevations during the full moon. So they're flying at higher altitudes during the full moon, and we're not sure exactly why. It may be to avoid predators, but perhaps next year I could present some results on our wing activity devices. But there was a lunar eclipse in January of last year, and during that lunar eclipse, without the full moon, they descended. So it's certainly the full moon is having some effect on their flight behavior. So in conclusion, black swifts are foraging in areas near rivers, and they're foraging at higher elevations. And they have a tendency to return to the nest and forage near the nest in the early mornings. We would like to incorporate other colonies to develop a population level movement model. We have stronger inference if we know that the population has similar movement patterns. And we also want to tease out what's going on with the aerial roosting during the wintering period. There's a lot of questions this raises. So we'll hopefully be able to slowly solve this puzzle. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all our funders, especially Lois Webster Fund and the Denver Audubon. We really appreciate all your support. It's really challenging to find the fund, so thank you, and thank you to all our collaborators. And I'm not sure if I have time for questions.
I'm sure you do. This is Karen, and we have some interesting questions for you, Rob. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, a real basic question. Tell us about the GPS units. How much do they weigh and what's their battery life?
Sure, great question. They weigh 1.25 grams. So there's a threshold we keep them under, the ratio of body weight to the GPS units. And their battery life, they could hold 1,600 points. And their battery life depends on whether they have solar panels on them, so it'll depend on whether we could recharge them with the sun. We've been pretty successful with that one GPS unit, and we've learned a few things. They'll, with the sun, they could last more than a year. If they're not getting sun, the battery will die within a few weeks.
Interesting. You've said 1 egg per nest. So I assume that means a pair of black swift, if they had a successful nest each of 3 years, then they could have an effect on increasing the population. Have I got that right?
Yeah, certainly. If black swifts are successful in fledging young, there's a lot of other factors that may have implications on the demographic rates. But yeah, certainly if they're successful in hatching, it's a good thing.
Okay, and that leads to some obvious next questions. Do you have any sense of how successful they are with nesting?
Yeah, there was a paper that Sue Hirschman out of Box Canyon, trying to remember the nesting success rate, but it was really high. I think we could fine tune that model to get better estimates, but I don't want to misquote the exact results, but they were really high, as expected with one young. Yeah.
And do you have a sense of the population in the Box Canyon there, whether in that particular habitat the population is increasing? You said overall the population is not is in steep decline. Do you have a sense of the population there in that Box Canyon area that you've been studying?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Our sense for the population of black swifts in Colorado are that they're, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty because we don't have monitoring data, but from the visits to the sites to these larger colonies, they seem to be doing fairly well. They've been consistent. We did look at the abundance at Zapata Falls using our mist netting data set, and we did see some fluctuation as expected in the population, but it was pretty constant throughout the year. So we think that the larger colonies are kind of a source, and so they may not be representative of all the sites, especially smaller sites across their breeding range. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, and yes, thank you. And that goes to a similar or related question, which is when you don't recapture devices, is that because you think the birds die or the device is lost, or do you have any sense of what happens when when you're not able to recover them?
Yeah, it could be a number of things that, and some of them that you mentioned. So they could either still be out there, or they could have died. But we feel like, at least for the wing activity devices, we had like a 86% recapture rate. So we recaptured 6 of 7. So for that, the wing activity data set, we were pretty successful. For the GPS devices, we're still waiting to see how many recover in 2020 from the 13 we deployed last year. So it's really hard to say. From the birds we did recapture, they were all healthy. So we don't think it's having a significant effect on their
On the birds.
survival rate. Yeah.
Good. And then we have a question about aerial roosting and some of the other behaviors. Can you tell us just a little bit like a day in the life of a black swift in Box Canyon? And use some of the terms, but explain what they are.
Sure. So the aerial roosting occurs in the wintering period, but during the breeding season, if you go to Box Canyon, the day in the life of a black swift is they're early risers. They probably leave the colony around 5, and they have really interesting social interactions during those early hours where they'll circle around their colony and they'll make their typical call note, and a lot of other social behaviors like this have been observed in other aerial insectivores, and after a while they'll just disappear. And as this data set showed, they forage long distances away from the nest, and then eventually returning back to the nest site to roost at nighttime.
So they overnight in the nest, and then down in South America, at nighttime they aerial roost?
Correct. Yeah.
And
So,
describe what that means.
so what that means is that they're flying on the wing. So they're in the air, flying 24 hours a day. So the wing activity device graph I showed is there seem to be more wing activity at nighttime because there aren't thermals at night. And then during the day, there was a decrease in wing activity where we think they're on the thermals, but they're just flying very obviously aerial, evolved to be in the air.
Hmm. And could I have watched, what's the name of the bird? Whippoorwill family
Uh-huh.
birds at night be much more active feeding up high. Could the full moon enable more insects to be out and about at night? And could that be part of the activity during the full moon, feeding?
Yeah, I mean, our first thought is that it didn't have anything to do because they were going at such high altitudes. They were reaching up to almost 4,000 meters. And we don't have radar data that could show if insects are up that high. They do get up that high, but it's really cold up there. So we don't think they're foraging during that behavior. I think they might be trying to avoid predators, but we're still trying to tease that part of the puzzle out.
Interesting.
Good question.
Okay, and a final question that has to do with, you mentioned management recommendations. To what degree have you been successful in getting the managers of the Box Canyon area to listen to your research, and to what degree have they made some of the management recommendations that you've given them? And also, is climate change any effect to these birds, as far as you know, in the areas that you've studied?
Yeah. So the first question with regards to management being accepted or implemented, this is brand new information, so we're still trying to get out the information. We're still working on some papers. So once we get the information out, we certainly hope that they'll heed our advice or at least take some of the recommendations that they can implement. So we're still working on that piece. And then the second question, what was your second question?
Possible effects of climate change.
Oh yeah, so the possible effects of climate change. Certainly, yeah. I mean, we're seeing a large, a steep population decline across aerial insectivores. So this isn't just black swifts, and we think that they're large-scale environmental factors. Now, whether it's climate change or not, it could be a combination of things, but certainly climate change is affecting the larger guild of aerial insectivores. For black swifts specifically, it could reduce snow, glaciers, snowpack influence, insect availability as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rob.